So this is the second part of my sports file two-parter on the 1974 Summit Series hockey tournament between Team Canada or Team WHA or Team Canada International versus Team Russia, Team USSR, CCCP, whatever. This was kind of an unofficial sequel to the Summit Series of 1972 where the NHL players had taken on the best of Russia, the world champions actually, and won the series with three wins in Russia in the last three contests to win 4 games to three with one tie. Now, by the time 1974 came along, there was an indication that the WHA was looking at making this international tournament all about the talent and the popularity of the WHA. In 73, 74, Gordie Howe, Mark Howe, and Marty, his two sons, had joined the WHA. This was the second year of the league with Bobby Hull as a showcase. Top players like Frank Mahovlich and Paul Anderson had just recently joined. So it was more of a feeling out for Team Russia at the time. And Russia arguably had approached Team Canada reps for the series. And, the WHA was looking at, great publicity. Now, the key player in my mind in these games was Bobby Hull. Bobby Hull had a great series. He um, he kind of was the unofficial MVP. Although memory doesn't serve, I don't think there was a named MVP. Hull had played all 8 games, scoring 7 goals with 2 assists. Now Yakushev was the big and Harlamov were the big two for the Russians. He combined for 16 points, including 8 goals and 8 assists. Ralph Backstrom also had a great series with 7 points, including 3 goals. Gordie Howe, who didn't, I don't think he played the first game, had 7 points, including 3 goals. Andre Lacroix, a very underrated player, had 7 points, including 6 assists in the series. And a stalwart for Canada on defense, J.C. Tremblay had a goal and 4 assists for 5 points. Now, the idea about this series, it's mostly the feeling out of the Canada games that really stands out for me. In the first game in Quebec City, Canada and the Russians played to a 3-3 tie. And in game two in Toronto, which was kind of a parallel from the 72 series, the Canada dominated that game. Actually, they led 3-0 by the midway mark of the second period, with J.C. Tremblay wrapping up the scoring in the third period, 3 minutes left. And game three, which was probably the biggest shootout you've ever seen in international hockey. 13 goals were scored, including 7 in the third period, where Canada had come back with 3 late goals to make it 7-5, but Lebedev had scored 2 minutes left to make it 8-5. Now, game four in Vancouver, another high scoring game, 5-5 tie. That was well known for Hull's 3 goals in the first period. Not a natural hat trick, but pretty close. Canada had led 5-2 after the first period that game and kind of blew it because they gave up 2 goals late in the third period. So Canada goes back to Russia with 1 win, 1 loss, and 2 ties, and still with hopes of winning the series. Now, game five, which had some transmission problems in Canada, uh, the teams were actually tied 1-1 until the 15-minute mark of the second period when Malsev scored a very big goal at 15:04. Um, a late goal by Mark Howe made it 3-2, but Canada was playing catch up for most of the game because he had played, the first period wasn't theirs. Malsev had scored, and until Gordie Howe's goal, the game was pretty well the Russians. Now, game six was probably the backbreaker for Team Canada. They were behind 2-0 by the 3 minute mark in the first period. And even though they had a slight comeback in the second to tie it up, they gave up three straight goals in the second and third period to lose 5-2. Now, where it got completely bizarre, because Canada had to win the last 2 games to tie the series, and they were having trouble in the series with Kampala. Kampala was a very important negative referee in the 1970 series with Abada. Kampala really lost his composure in Game 7 and Game 8. Now, Game 7 was pretty well all Russia, 2-0 after the first 7 minutes of the first period, until Webster scored to make it 2-1. and then Backstrom and Howe early in the third period, second period, to go ahead 3-2. Russians took back the lead, and Backstrom tied at 4-4 in the third. Now, there was some question if seconds that were allowed to tick off the clock worked against Team Canada at the end. I think it did because he scored a goal which would be with about zero point 0.2 left on the clock, but because the end of game light came on, the goal didn't count. Bobby Hull did the tip in, and there was many complaints after the end of the game, and the old bugaboo saying that Team Canada was getting bad refereeing in Russia. I watched most of the series in repeats. And I think most of the penalties actually he took in '74 were deserved. The '74 Team International and Team Canada was a very they couldn't control their sticks. And the infamous situation where Pat Stapleton was mad about a injury and he went up to the referee and took the blood from his chin and rubbed it on the referee's face, which would be considered assault in 2020. But I think he just got a 10-minute misconduct. Now, game eight, Backstrom had scored early. Like I said, Backstrom had a good series. And even though the Russians tied it up in the second, uh, they had two third period goals that put them at 3-2, and Backstrom scored late, but a little bit, half a dozen and six short, as we say. But what really stands out for me the series was the great Team Canada offense and their what do you call not say their bad defense, but when you needed to not give up a goal, they were giving up a goal. Like people like Pat Stapleton and Ray John Howe and some of the forwards, they weren't considered defensive forwards. WHA was comparable to QMJHL or the Q, where you're getting a lot of goals, some really big saves, but most games in the Q very rarely end up 2-1. But could Team Canada have won the series? That's some other questions over the years. Um, I really think it came down to game five. If they would have won game five, they would easily have picked up another game in the series, and who knows what's going to be happen. When you have three tie games against the Russians and one victory in the 8 game series, and really most Canadian players were not in shape in mid September in any season. Once the series went on, it seems like Canada's offense really got better. But you got to understand this: he scored what was it now? One, two, three, 4 games. He scored four or more goals against the Russians. Known for good defense, good offense. But was really, really bizarre for me is just that the reaction of the announcers, Don Chevalier, Johnny Esau, were basically, not say they were homers, but they were complaining, especially in Game 7 and Game 8, how badly the refereeing was treating Canada. But I mean, the NHL style, if anybody remembers in the '70s, the sticks were high, the gloves were high. In the case of Gordie Howe, the elbow was high. I don't think hating your enemies could win in hockey. You have to beat your enemies. But I think emotionally, Team Canada had feel they had the weight of being, an outlaw league against the NHL. They were not really considered a full Team Canada because of some of Team Canada's best amateur players that were not WHA, and some people felt maybe the NHL could have lent them a couple of players. Can you imagine if Gilbert Perreault and Marcel Dion and Guy Lafleur? Can you imagine Guy Lafleur against the Russians? The big guy Surferson, I mean, him and Pro in the same line. So it wasn't really Team Canada. It wasn't really Team WHA because the Americans weren't allowed to play. There was no Europeans, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know what the configuration was, but he basically said just team or Canadian by birth, or like in the case of Gordie Howe's kids, where your father is Canadian. I think it ranks at least a top five international series of all time, and including World Championships because of what the WHA meant at the time. There was a lot of vintage players that had their careers extended that needed to have their careers extension because with expansion, there was no more room for them to play. It gave second life to players like Shaky Walton and Backstrom. In a lot of ways, Henderson, because Henderson felt and Mahovlich felt kind of left out by the Canadians and the Maple Leafs in the NHL. They felt they weren't respected, and Mahovlich had done enough in the NHL to not have to prove anymore, especially with Detroit and Montreal in his key years after Toronto. So if you have a chance, go on YouTube. There's a lot of Summit Series 74 stuff out there. I would gather because I'm seeing more. I made a little misnomer in the last one. The DVD couldn't find Game Five. There is part of Game Five, what do you call, uploaded on YouTube, but the full tape is not there because with transmission from Russia, especially '72, the remote shift or the editing was terrible, and I think it was still transatlantic microscopic cable. It wasn't pure satellite, or if it was satellite, it's just like the old dial-up internet where the power cycle goes out and your modem kind of freaks out for a few seconds. But again, Jerry Cheevers and that made a big difference, but Don McLeod was not the best pick on that. If I'm not mistaken, Richard Brodeur wasn't really in the league at the time. He would have been good as a backup, and Gilles Gratton was just basically, just a filler. I mean, he was okay, but you got to look at the former Montreal Canadiens with that team, Hull, Mahovlich. You look at the former Maple Leafs, Henderson and Mahovlich, of course. You look at Bobby Hull. Bobby Hull skated miles in his series. It's probably the smoothest performance by any Bobby Hull of his era. Because every year Bobby Hull would kind of change a little bit, and he didn't have Hedberg and Nielsen to play with. That's why he scored a lot more goals because when he was given somebody to play with, you know. But the Big Ice Surface, a lot of good plays, a lot of end-to-end rushes, and the Russians were basically a little bit before their prime and a little bit after their prime because this wasn't the Canada Cup '81. This wasn't the '76 Olympics team. It wasn't the multiple World Championship winner. Um, but look at what it changed. Within 3 years, Canada was back at the World Championships, despite the fact that we're trying to make Esposito put on a helmet. That's another podcast for future. The hatred that Team Canada had in '72 wasn't really there in '74 because, no offense, most of the team WHA were getting so much in endorsements and so much in paid. They were getting paid more in the NHL. Sometimes money, cures all evils. I remember '72 they were playing for the pension plan. And let me tell you, there was a lot of people saying we're underpaid here. And even Frank Mahovlich, who was totally paranoid in '72, the famous incident where he thought it was a bug and he unhooked the chandelier that fell to the floor. Last I checked, Mahovlich wasn't making allegations of the gulag while the play was going on because rumor has it he was basically passing by the Soviet bench and saying, what are you gonna do? Send me to Siberia, a bunch of bastards and all that. But it's a crazy time. 36 years ago, it was a different world. There was no, nuclear weapons pointing against the West, and we were going in the middle of Russia in September, which is a bad time to go to Russia if you know your history, and basically playing hockey and having referees against us and the fans against us, like the shrill sounds in the crowd. If you hear, by the way, you watch those games when you're hearing the whistle. That's how fans in Russia used to say a negative thing. They would never boo; they would whistle. So you would hear chants of "Let's go home" by the Canadians when we're being shafted, and you hear the whistles at the same time. If you're American, you wouldn't even get the what do you call the subtlety of this bullshit between Russia and Canada over the years. We never really hated the Russians politically. We hated them because they stole our game and they wouldn't allow us to play against them with our best players because the way the IAAHF was run, it was the Eastern Europeans that were kind of running it. And, you know, Canada created hockey in, like, for example, '68. Let's say, for argument's sake, to go to the Olympics with Beliveau, okay, John Ferguson, Phil Esposito, Bobby Orr, all the great Ranger players, the great Detroit players, Howe, Delvecchio. Can you imagine we would have done the '68 Olympics if we were allowed? You saw in 2002 how the professionals going into the Olympics really finally paid off for Canada with that gold medal, and you look at the Crosby year, 2010. But it mind boggles. I mean, it was a different era altogether, and thank God we'll never see it again. So in this, what I'm calling COVID Thursday, what I'm going to try to do every Thursday is post a YouTube podcast if I can. I really appreciate all the listeners out there. We passed 67,000 page views on our circuit earlier today, which is amazing because there's no monetization, there's no promotion rather than word of mouth, there's Google searches, and one person tells another person. So if you listen to this podcast and you're a fan of Team Canada in the '70s, I might do something on the World Championship tournaments he participated in. It was a weird thing because every year it was the same team sending over. California Golden Seals and Cleveland Barons and Kansas City Scouts and Pittsburgh Penguins. This is how it worked, ladies and gentlemen. If the team didn't make the playoffs, they could play for Team Canada. Can you imagine? A total abject failure in the regular season or the playoffs. You go over internationally to play for Canada, get paid for it. What a strange world we live in at the time, and we couldn't recognize half the players because half the players were, 8 points and 22 assists, 8 goals, 22 assists in a season, and 70 goals. You know, anyway, yeah, we'll talk about it more later. So have a great day. Take care of yourself. Wash your hands. Don't wash your hands of other people because that's a 6 foot rule they're talking about. In New Brunswick right now, if you're illegally 6 feet away from somebody without their permission, you can be charged. So keep your distance and get a tape measure. Maybe put a 6 foot dome around your body just to be sure. Have a good day. Bye.